This video is sponsored by PageProof.
Hi, my name is Chuck Weger, and this is Creative Conversations. Today we're talking with Frank Romano, one of the historical giant figures of the publishing industry. Frank, you've been in publishing more than 50 years, right?
I started in 1959 at the Mergenthaler Linotype company, right out of high school.
And how did that happen to be? Did you just wander in there?
I was graduating high school in 59. I needed a job, so I went to my guidance counselor. And he said, I know of one at this company, Mergenthaler Linotype. I said, what do they do? He said, something to do with books. I said, that sounds interesting. So I went for an interview, and I went with another student. I got the job, and he didn't. His name is Bernie Sanders. And I started as the mail boy. I delivered the mail. And by the way, I delivered the mail to Herman Zoff, Matthew Carter, all the giants of the typographic industry, because they would come to Mergenthaler to do various projects. My favorite story is I was delivering the mail to Herman Zoff one day, and I walked into his cubicle and I said, Mr. Zoff, what do you do? And he said, I correct the errors of my youth. He was modifying Palatino from hot metal to photo typesetting. Who knew that 30 odd years later, I would have his endowed chair at RIT? These are the great
Yes,
stories.
I forgot to mention that you have been a professor at RIT since the 1700s, I think, right?
That is correct, the medieval period.
Yeah.
So that's where I began. I worked my way up through all the departments in the company and wound up as the assistant advertising manager. And from there, I didn't want to move out to Long Island when they moved from Brooklyn. And so the guys at Visual Graphics knew who I was, and they hired me as their first ad manager. And I don't know if you remember the machine, the Phototypepositor. It was a headlining machine that allowed you to expand, condense, and tighten up type. It was a really creative machine. It opened up the entire market for display type. And then after several years, we decided to move to New England, and I went to work for CompuGraphic, which was one of the first companies in photo typesetting. At our show in 1968, people would come to the booth and look at the machine and the sample, and they would say, that's crap. And how much is the machine? $8,000. That's not bad crap. And that's how CompuGraphic started, selling very inexpensive photo typesetting machines. So I'm one of the last people that worked in the hot metal world, in the photo typesetting world, and the digital world. So I've seen that whole evolution. And by the way, somewhere around January of 2022, we hit 1 million typefaces. In the entire history of the world, we did not have 1 million typefaces.
And Wired magazine uses them all in every issue.
That is correct. Actually, if you go back in time, there were a number of magazines. Roger Black was very famous in Rolling Stone for mixing about 20 typefaces in a deck at the beginning of an article.
Well, that's enough about biography. Let's go back and start at the beginning. We've got this episode is about type and typography, and we're not going to start with the Koreans or the Chinese or any of the other older civilizations that fiddled around with type. We're going to start with Gutenberg, I think, because everybody knows.
It has to begin with him because he really didn't invent printing. He invented movable type. His problem was matching the handwriting of the scribes. That was the biggest thing. Handwritten books were the big thing at the time. He wanted to figure out a way to mechanize that process. Now, along the way, he really fumbled because it took him 3 tries in order to create the font. The 36-line font, the 40-line font, and the 42-line font. That's how many lines there were in a column. With 36 lines, he would have 4 volumes. That was too much paper. It was going to cost too much. Then he made a mistake when he went to 40. He should have gone to 42, and that's 2 volumes. The Gutenberg Bible is 2 volumes. Most people forget that, by the way. So it took him all that time, 7 years, to produce the final typeface for the Bible. And it matched the handwriting of the scribes. We start to see new typefaces come along around 1470 when Nicholas Jensen creates the first Roman typeface. That is a typeface with serifs. And then you have.
And why did he do that? Why were serifs important back then? Or
because
now?
they were looking at the ancient Romans and the inscriptions on their statuary. And when they painted the letters, at the end of the stroke, they would have a little flourish, and the stonemason would come in and carve it out, and they liked the way it looked. And so it was decided to do type that way as well. And Jensen creates the first Roman typeface, which is the model for all serif typefaces forever, if you will. And then you come to Aldus Manutius around 1500 or so, and he creates the Italic typeface based on the Italic handwriting style. And then you come to 1511 when Claude Garamond is the first printer to produce a typeface that he sells to other printers and becomes a very popular style. And in fact, to this day, Garamond is one of the most popular typefaces on earth. But because it has gone through so many iterations, most people don't know it by that name in many cases. So after 1511, you now start to see more and more printers creating different typefaces. And by the time you get to the 1600s, you have the first major foundry, the Caslon foundry in England, and they supplied the type for all of the British affiliates around the world. So Ben Franklin bought his type from Caslon. Now,
and we're still talking about type on wood blocks, right?
No, we're talking about metal type.
Metal type, okay.
Yeah, we don't get to wood type until we get to the Victorian era, when very large type is used for posters. And to do it in metal would be too heavy. And so that's when wood type comes along.
Okay. So this was metal, and they cast it, they made a mold. How does that work?
Originally, they would carve the punch and then punch it into soft metal and then cast it. And then as time went on, they found more mechanized ways of doing it. The foundries, and again, Caslon was the first, but the foundries, every country had a number of foundries that made type for newspaper. One newspaper could keep one foundry in business because they used so much type. And as the newspaper industry grew, the number of typefaces increased because the number of foundries increased.
And type had a finite lifestyle, right? You could print with it so many times and then you'd have to throw it away or melt it down, or what would happen with that?
You'd buy new type. That was the biggest problem that colonial printers had, because the time frame from getting the type from England was like months and months to get it. I mean, if you look at the evolution of type, it's a very interesting story. So you get to the United States around 1850 or so, and you have about 40 foundries. In 1886, the Linotype is invented, and it is its own foundry. And as a result, 23 foundries merge into the American Type Founders because the market for handset type went away.
Let's go back a minute and talk about the Linotype. That's a pretty important thing. The Linotype was the first, or just one of many casting machines, hot metal casting machines?
There were about 100 patents that had been filed up to 1886 for people trying to mechanize typesetting. The Linotype was the only one that really succeeded. Ottmar Mergenthaler was a German immigrant, and he gets involved with the guy who is testing the typewriter. And he saw.
I think our viewers know what a typewriter is. I'm pretty sure.
That's right. Well, James Ogilvy Clephane was a court reporter in Washington, D.C. And when the typewriter comes out, he tests it for Christopher Latham Scholes. Scholes then sells the rights to the Remington Arms Company, and the typewriter goes down a certain road. But Clephane had this crazy idea because lithography was coming in, and he was using lithostones to write copy backwards in order to reproduce documents for legal work. And so his idea is that if he could type on a piece of paper and the ink was still wet, he could transfer it by pressing it down on a lithostone, and therefore it would be in reverse and he could print from it. Unfortunately, the ink dried at different levels. So he needed a typewriter that did one line at a time efficiently. So he had somebody invent the device, but it wasn't working. So they went to a machine shop in Washington, D.C., and they meet this German immigrant named Mergenthaler. And he says, all right, I can fix that problem, but that's not the way to do it. You probably should be casting metal. And so they fund him, and he goes through 2 prototypes. One of them is here at the Museum of Printing, where I am right now. And they don't work, but the third one works. And so in 1886, the Linotype is installed at the New York Tribune, and the proprietor, the publisher, looks at the output and says, "Gee, Otmar, a Linotype," and that's how it got named.
When you used a Linotype, you wound up with a piece of metal like this, right?
Called a slug.
And why is it called a slug? This is a slug that a client gave to me years ago.
Because that's what they called them. It was a line of type, and it's a slug. That one uses a recessed liner. That's why you have the little slots at the top. That was a way of using less lead when you cast it. Remember that lead was at 550 degrees and was ejected into the line of matrices, molds. And the manufacturing process for matrices was unbelievable. Even when I was there in the 60s, we had about 400 people involved in producing typefaces.
And what were most of those people doing? I mean, one person was the designer, right? Like Zapp or
Zapp or Dwiggins. What they would do is submit basic drawings, and then the lettering office would have people who would convert them to drawings that were a foot high, 12 inches high, and they were on paper in pencil, and they were right reading. And the reason was you could turn it over on a light table and it would be wrong reading.
Okay.
So first of all, you had to go through all the drawings, and the designers didn't do that. That was the type office. Then they would trace that in a machine called a pantograph, and the pantograph would convert the very large drawing by cutting a piece of metal that was about 4 inches, and that was a pattern plate. After they produced the pattern plates in brass, they would trace it in another pantograph, and it would then produce the punch. And then the punch would go into a machine and it would be punched into little blank pieces of brass, and that would be the matrix. And so it was an unbelievable set of operations to produce these little pieces of brass for every letter in every font in every size.
That sounds enormously complicated. And how long did it take? So let's say I came to you and I say, I need a new font and I want it to be called Chuck, and I want you to design it for me. What's the time frame from that request to actually being able to use it in a Linotype?
About a year.
Okay.
So again, very famous designers came to Mergenthaler, and Mergenthaler was the key company. Their typefaces, that library, became the key library that everyone had to copy when we moved into photo typesetting. Now, there was also the Monotype Library. They had a process that was very similar. There was the Intertype Library, and then the Ludlow Library. All of those machines cast metal, and they all had a process very similar to create their typefaces.
How did they get around? I mean, Mergenthaler must have had patents, but they were all slightly different.
No. Since the very beginning of the Copyright Act, typefaces have been excluded.
But I mean the machinery to set the type.
Yes, they had very strong patents. That's why the Intertype company was formed in 1913 when the first set of Mergenthaler patents expired.
Ah, okay. Okay. So you have all these companies producing all this metal type with a lot of lead, and that's why everybody grew up stupid, because we all inhaled lead, right, from the typesetting machines.
By the way, it was it was lead, it was tin, and it was antimony. So it was 3 different metals in there. Here at the museum, we never use the term lead. We use the term type metal.
Ah, because you get in a lot of trouble with the state.
The insurance company goes crazy. So this is the slug casting era. Now, even from the 1930s, when offset lithography was coming into use, everyone said, well, why do we do that? We have to set the type in metal, make a proof of it, and then photograph it to film. Why can't we go directly to the film? So there were attempts through the 30s, a lot stopped during the war, but then in the 1950s, it started up again. Why can't we have machines that set type photographically?
We're going to get to lithography in another conversation, but yeah, lithography briefly is how printing was done, right?
That is correct. That was the main, well, letterpress dominated.
Well, okay.
Offset lithographers were said to only produce quick and dirty printing. Offset was not considered a quality process for a long time. But again, they wanted type that would work with offset lithography, and that became photo typesetting. So in 1959, you have the photo setter, the first photo typesetting machine. And then in 1954, you have the photon, the first true photo typesetting machine.
What is it? What does photo typesetting mean exactly?
Photo typesetting means that I'm using photography to photograph a character onto a piece of film.
And that film is then exposed and used in the printing. It's used to make printing plates.
That is correct. Because I need film in order to make plates. That was the process at the time.
Okay. And what did they, I don't understand how a photo typesetter, so a photo typesetter would take a picture of a piece of type. So how did that work? Did a person have to put in a film blank and then say, take a picture of this, and then the next one and take a picture of that?
This is actually the negative for a font for the iTech Quadratech. All the characters are around here. And this would go on a piece of plastic, and then you would put these in the machines. You would have 4 of them at one time. So you would have 4 different fonts, and then there was a set of lenses that made them bigger or smaller. So xenon light would flash through the negative character, through a lens, and then expose photo film or photo paper.
And they had to have some mechanism of moving the things around so you could get different letters onto different positions on the final film, right?
Well, you're only working on a line. At that time, you only had one line that you could use, and then your leading advanced to the next line. So doing any fancy composition was not possible until much later. But everybody had a different format for these masters. That was the one thing that you could save and protect. But the font itself, the design of the font, they stole them. And they stole them from hot metal. And the way that worked was really interesting. They would make a proof of a hot metal font. Take the Linotype slugs, ink them, make a proof, and then they would enlarge them. And here's a good example because it's jagged and really bad around the edges. Well, you can't use that for typesetting. So what they would do then is they would cut a ruby lith. By the way, there's a term you haven't heard recently.
Right. And we'll go into that when we talk about offset printing and lithography and things like that.
Well, they use ruby lith in order to trace the letter, in order to create a clean, sharp edge. Now, in some cases, they got it exactly right. In some cases, they didn't. So photo typesetting had a bad reputation for a long time because the fonts were not very good at all. And then they had different methods for making art. They would use white paint on a black background, or they would use a big negative of a piece of film. But the race was on in order to convert all these hot metal libraries into photo typesetting because that's what everybody wanted. I'll give you a good example. I did consulting for the National Enquirer.
Yes, you're responsible for that publication.
I am.
All right.
Generoso Pope was the publisher. And when I went there, he had been producing it with hot metal. And he wanted to convert to photo typesetting. But he wanted the same font that he had in hot metal, which was a terrible Intertype font. But he paid $50,000 to have that font converted into photo typesetting because he wanted that same look for whatever reason.
That's interesting. I have a converse story. I worked in a pre-press shop in the 70s, maybe it was the 80s, one of those decades, and we did work for the Smithsonian in Washington. And the art director of Smithsonian Magazine did not like photo typesetting. He wanted hot type. So for years, after everybody else had gone to photo typesetting, we were still sending out stuff to a Linotype shop to get set for his publications.
Paul Rand, one of the most famous graphic designers, he designed the IBM logo, etc., loved hot metal. Now in hot metal, the spacing between the letters was a little wider than normal because you had the side bearings of the matrix that you had to deal with. Yes. So your problem was you did not have tight spacing at all. And that was the big rage in the 1970s and 80s. But Paul Rand only wanted the look of hot metal, of a Linotype. And so the typesetting company that did his work had to turn off all their technology because they were only in photo typesetting by this point in order not to kern or in any way to make tight spacing so it looked like hot metal. And that because that's exactly what Paul Rand wanted.
Wow. So you said something a while back that I wanted to pick up on again. You said that typefaces couldn't be copyrighted. Why is that? Why was that? Because
Congress could never figure out how to separate the things that made Times Roman from the letters of the alphabet. And they had this idea that somebody could wind up owning the letter E. I'm not kidding. This is the arguments went on forever about this. And it had to do with all kinds of design, like people who designed lamps. What made the design of the lamp different from a lamp where you just ran a wire up to a bulb? And so they specifically excluded design from the Copyright Act. So if you took all the things that made Helvetica Helvetica away from the letters, they don't stand on their own as design elements as such, because they're so intrinsically involved with the letter itself. The letter G has a certain design to it, and you have to accept that, and then you add to it whatever you want in terms of flourishes or whatever. So you can copyright the name. That's why it's called Arial, not Helvetica.
Okay, but it's the same font, basically.
Yes, they changed 5 letters very, very small, in a very small way, but it's exactly the same because it has the same width values. So the font you use from the PC is the same font, same width values as the font you use on the Mac.
And it's the same values that you used in photo typesetting?
Exactly right.
Okay.
And of course, Times Roman and Times New Roman were done at the same time. The London Times was converting to a new plate system. And so they needed a font that could make that transition from the moles to the plates. And so they hired Stanley Morrison to design a new font around 1930 or so. And so at the London Times, the Monotype machines, because Morrison worked for Monotype, were used for display type, whereas the Linotype machines were used for text. It was the first cross-licensing agreement. So Times New Roman was the Monotype version, and Times Roman was the Linotype version. That's why the names are slightly different, but the fonts are the same.
Wow. I always thought Times New Roman was like somehow better because
No,
it was new.
it was the Times New Roman,
Okay.
meaning a typeface with serifs.
Right. Okay. There's so much background and history in type. We could talk about this for decades, and you probably have, right? This is what you've been doing.
This is what I do for a living.
Yeah.
So we're now in the photo typesetting era. Every company is now making the transition, converting all. And by the way, they all have to start from scratch. So Photon has to do it. CompuGraphic has to do it. When I was at CompuGraphic, I was the marketing manager, and we had an annual meeting in our cafeteria. So I had photographs taken of how we made fonts, and I had them mounted and put on the walls to make it more interesting. And the head of the font division went to the founder of CompuGraphic and said, Romano's showing them how we make fonts. And he says, we could use the help. Because making type was a monumental process. There was a gigantic department of people to do that. And CompuGraphic had to do it, Photon had to do it, iTech had to do it, Verityper had to do it. Of the 20 companies involved in photo typesetting, they all had to start from scratch and convert hot metal faces into photo typesetting faces. All had the same job, and they all gave them different names. So
because the name could be copyrighted. That's
correct. My favorite was Verityper. They called Helvetica Megaron.
Megaron? I saw that movie. It was like one with the cars.
Monster. In fact, I published a book called The Analog that told you what the name was for, like, here's Helvetica, here's the name that everybody gives it. Photon called it Newton. They named it after a town in Massachusetts. Chelmsford was Optima. So
really?
Again, it was bizarre the way the whole thing worked. So we're going through the photo typesetting era, and we now come to Postscript.
Well, let's stay on the photo typesetting era for one moment. The photo typesetting era eventually became a thing where a designer would send copy out to essentially a service bureau, and they would deliver pages of all set type repro proofs. And the designer would then put those on the page the way they wanted them to be, along with the other page elements.
That is correct. So because most typesetting was done with metal, they would make a proof on a Vandercook press. And because they did there were 2 kinds of proofs. One could be a reader proof where they were really rough on it, or they were very careful about it, make sure every letter was clean and sharp. That was called a reproduction proof or a repro proof. And then they would go to the ad agency or graphic designer, and they would then cut them up, wax them, and paste them down on boards called mechanicals. In fact, I have a sample of a mechanical here at the museum, because when I say that word to high school kids, they have no idea what I'm talking about.
Right. I still don't know what you're talking about. And I actually know what you're talking about, but a lot of our viewers don't. Our 3 viewers don't have that idea. What is a mechanical exactly?
It's a board, and you pasted on it all the elements of the page where you wanted them. So you had 2 columns of type, and you had a black area where you wanted a picture. And if you had line art, you had that on there as a stat. So every element on there was represented and photographable. And so when you were done, they photographed it again to negative film. And that negative film was used to make the plate.
Okay. That sounds enormously complicated.
By the way, this was an era when we had full employment.
Yes, because everything was so inefficient.
Well, the other thing is, art directors and graphic designers love tighter spacing. I did work for an advertising agency in New York City, and I was looking at a mechanical, and the art director had cut every letter of a text paragraph and moved the letters closer together because he wanted tight spacing.
And they couldn't do that on the photo typesetter that they were using?
Well, that's correct, because most photo typesetters at that time did not have a backspace key. There was no command to do that. In fact, one of the great stories about this industry was in 1968, IBM introduced the IBM Composer. Do you remember that? It had the little Selectric element, but it had proportional type. There were 3 typewriters that did that: the Just-A-Writer, the Verityper, and the IBM Composer. And it was only a 9-unit system. Most type was 18 units. But at this show, they had a contest. Could you identify the hot metal version, the photo typesetting version, and the IBM version? What they did was, on the IBM Composer, there was a backspace key that moves backspace 1 unit. It was a teeny amount of space. And so they kerned most of the letters in the font. But they didn't kern it for photo typesetting. So everybody looked at the kerned one and said, oh, that must be photo typesetting. You can't do that on a typewriter. No one got it right.
Wow. Wow.
Because again, kerning and tight spacing were the mark of photo typesetting. As the machines matured, more and more of them could do that.
Okay. And the photo typesetting, if I wanted to put out a magazine ad, I'd have to send out for the type. And what's the turnaround time of that?
that was the big joke in the industry, by the way, because I used to work with a lot of typographers that worked for ad agencies, and they would get the job about 10 o'clock at night, and it would say first thing in the morning. And so all of them had to have night shifts in order to do that. And then I would go to the ad agency and watch the area where all this stuff came in. By the way, the big business in New York City at that time were messengers.
And still true, I think.
I don't know about that, because today so much stuff is done with PDF files. So as a result, they would come in and would go into a big pile, and the art directors would wander in about 10, 11. So the stuff would sit there for a long period of time before they actually used it. Yeah, I'm writing a book on the history of the typesetting service. I mean, if you think about it, you bought type from a company that set type for art directors, graphic designers, publishers, or whomever. That type of company doesn't exist anymore.
Well, lots of types of companies don't exist anymore. I mean, it's hard to find a buggy whip company.
No, by the way, they still make buggy whips because there are still horses.
Okay. All right.
Bad example.
Sorry.
Come up with something else.
Okay. It's hard to find a vacuum tube company. No, wait, they make vacuum tubes. All right. Moving along, you mentioned Postscript, but I want to come to Postscript didn't come out of the thing whole cloth. Before Postscript, there were other computerized type systems, right? What happened between photo typesetting and we had then computerized type?
Okay.
Before the Macintosh, let's say.
The big change that came about was using cathode ray tubes and lasers to set type rather than photography through a negative. That was the big change. So typesetting machines then changed into machines that had to store their letters as bitmaps or as rasters.
Okay.
And to convert fonts to do that was a big problem. And the thing that solved that problem was Icarus. This is the book that was written by Peter Caro on Icarus. And this was the life-saving element of the typesetting industry at that time, because now you could scan the artwork that you had in, and it would convert it into bitmaps, outlines, or whatever format you needed for your particular machine. So the film machines, the Mergenthaler VIP, very popular typesetting machine, the Linotron 202 replaced it because it used a cathode ray tube. Later, the Linotron used a laser to set the type. So we come into this new era, and once you have the ability to break the character down into bits, now you can do line art at the same time you're doing the type, and with laser machines, you can actually start to do the pictures. So the big movement now, as we get into the 1990s, late 1980s and early 1990s, is the movement to digital machines that can do text and graphics.
And they are not shining a light through film. They are taking a bitmap and using that to drive some laser or other optical thing.
Absolutely correct.
That exposes onto still exposes onto photographic paper, right? Exactly,
same thing. So it's either photo paper if you're going to paste it up, or film if you're going to go directly to plate.
Okay. So those companies were around, and then these two guys named John Warnock and Chuck Geschke formed a company who I think both were at Xerox, right?
Yes, and
Xerox PARC, in the research arm of Xerox.
Yes, and they were working on a project. As you know, they come out with the Docutech, and then they were working on other output devices, and they were storing all their fonts as bitmaps.
Mm-hmm.
And so they came up with the idea of outline fonts, would make it much more efficient. You could have one master and create all the sizes that you wanted. But Xerox saw no market for that. So when they left Xerox PARC and created Adobe, their business plan was for a computer typesetting system with a big cathode ray tube where you could see the entire page and images on the screen, and that would output directly to film, and you would bypass all the other steps. And Postscript was just the output module.
And Postscript came to be because John Warnock had worked on something similar at Adobe?
No, he had worked on something similar at a company in Utah. I forget the name of the company. It had two names.
Okay.
And they were developing a system that was very interesting. It had to do with tracking all of the ships in a harbor and keeping track of where they all were exactly. And so it had to do with graphic images and being able to manipulate them and move them around in real time. And that's where I think he got most of the ideas for Postscript.
Okay. And Postscript came out because it predated the Macintosh, but Steve Jobs saw it or something. What is the story there? How did Postscript and the Macintosh become so intertwined?
We gave an award to Geschke and Warnock, and Geschke came to RIT, and I drove him everywhere, and he told me all these great stories about it. So they invited Steve Jobs through a mutual friend to come and see what they were doing. And he comes and he sees everything they're doing, and he says, I'm interested in that output module. Everything else doesn't matter to me. Because what he was doing with the Macintosh was sort of getting in the same world that they were in terms of making up a page. And so he puts several $1 million into Adobe to get the rights to Postscript for this laser printer he's developing with Canon that's going to come with 13 free fonts, because that's how much the memory could hold.
And that was called the LaserWriter.
The LaserWriter 1, because then 2 years later was the LaserWriter 2 that had 35 free fonts. And that set of 13 fonts and the set of 35 fonts became the standards for the entire industry.
For a while, yeah.
Well, even to this day, the most used fonts on earth are Times Roman, Times New Roman, Arial, Helvetica. Those are the most used fonts on this planet. You know why? They're free.
Well, a lot of fonts are free, and we're going to talk about that in a minute. But so Steve Jobs saw this. He wanted Postscript, and Postscript was used to produce vector fonts that you could scale to any size, right?
Correct.
Without worrying about looking really jagged and rastery if you took a small raster image and blew it up. Well, and this is all before Photoshop, right?
Yes,
Photoshop, yes. Adobe was a type company and a company that made raster image processors.
That is correct. By the way, Photoshop was actually created by a different company. Right. It was the Barney Scan utility program, if you recall.
Yeah.
In any case, they had, because the laser writer was only 300 DPI, they had to come up with a secret sauce, and that hinting that allowed them to do a better job at low res with the fonts was the key to Postscript at the beginning. It could make a low res device look better than it was.
We've sort of, in our rush to Postscript, we've sort of skipped over the image writer, which was an important part of things too, right? I mean, before Postscript, there were dot matrix printers, right?
Oh, tons. The Centronics was the first one.
How did they work?
The Centronics printer, that was Bob Howard. He was partners with Dr. Wang, and
of the Wang word processing systems.
That's correct. And they had a falling out. So when they split, he took all of the printer patents with him, and he started Centronics, and it used a little pin, and the little pin hit through a ribbon onto paper and created dots. They were very crude dots, but you could make up crazy kinds of images with them, etc. And so the Centronics became the most popular printer for computer systems. They were used for, airline check-in and all that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. Businesses had them, and it made Bob Howard a multi-billionaire.
And you could do fonts on the Centronics and similar printers, right? Because you could change which pins got fired.
Yes, and then the resolution went up. They started out like 7:9 matrices, and then they went to 13:16, and then they went higher than that. And as the resolution got better, you got better quality out of them. But still, they were dot matrix, and you were still limited in that regard. And so you had a lot of printers at that time that were based on the Centronics model.
Okay. And then we came to the image writer, which was basically a dot matrix printer. But
Absolutely.
They had it integrated so well with the Macintosh that what you saw on the screen could be printed out on this printer.
Yes. In fact, I have one here at the museum. I got it when I got my Lisa, by the way. I have a Lisa here, by the way.
Let's take a break for a minute and talk about, you're at the Museum of Printing. Tell us about that.
The Museum of Printing was formed in 1978 to preserve the history of the printing industry. And so we have a large typesetting area. We're working Linotype, a working Ludlow machine. We have a Monotype. We have the only collection of photo typesetting machines in the world. And I have collected the font for every machine. So if you want to see what the font for a Phototronic looked like, we have it here.
And where is this museum?
It's in a place called Haverhill, spelled Haverhill, but pronounced Haverhill. We're in New England, remember, just north of Boston.
Okay.
And so we have a very large collection of computers as well. So not only do I have the first 4 Macintoshes, but I have a whole batch of PCs, a next machine, which I don't think many people have, and a whole batch of different printers, if you will. So it's a great collection of stuff, and we need to organize it a little bit better than it is.
I remember the Smithsonian used to have an exhibit on printing, and they had a metal press, and they had some stuff about Linotype, and it all went away at some point.
Yes, they closed it down. It's all now in storage in Suitland, Maryland. In fact, the Smithsonian is giving us some stuff because they no longer want industrial displays. So the printing exhibit, which was a wonderful exhibit of the history of printing, is gone.
Wow. Okay. Because history doesn't matter.
Well, most museums in the world today really care more about cultural exhibits, which is interesting.
So, all right. So that's the Museum of Printing in Haverhill, Mass. Is there a URL? Haverhill, sorry. Is there a URL?
Yes, museumoffprinting.org.
Okay. We'll have our crack post-production team put that URL in somewhere.
So yes, I have saved all that. And by the way, we also have all the drawings for every Linotype font done in the 20th century. I have the drawings for Helvetica, Palatino.
So if I wanted to go and make my own version of Helvetica, call it Chuck Vetica, I could do that from your drawings.
Those drawings were used in a very specific system that I described that doesn't exist anymore.
Oh, I would use a Raspberry Pi to build a new system to do that.
Oh, okay, I got you. Yes, and we have a lot of artwork. That's how I have all this stuff. This is artwork from the Intertype Library. So we've been collecting all of that, plus 8,000 books about this whole area. And in fact, above me are some of my I have the largest collection of type specimen books in the world, from the hot metal foundries through the photo typesetting companies into the digital era. So, in fact, we had a guy here yesterday who was trying to research a font that was used on a NASA emblem, a patch, in 1972. And so we were able to narrow it down to a font called Venus, a hot metal font that somebody took and modified slightly for 3 letters. That's why he couldn't identify it, because what the font wouldn't handle it properly. So people come here all the time. In fact, a guy came here the other day with something that he says was given to him by Tim Berners-Lee, announcing the World Wide Web for the first time. Could I date it?
Wow.
And it's very close to dating it because it's in Optima with a dot matrix font, which means it has to be Xerox.
Wow. Font detective. Frank Romano, font detective. That's we're going to start a TV show about that.
One of my students has that title. I'm a forensic typographer. I do a lot of expert work on forgery and counterfeiting because I'm the last person who worked in all those worlds and can identify some of these fonts or the way they were produced.
Wow.
When I go, that's the end of an era.
So then I can start forging a lot of things.
That is correct. I'm not there to help save you.
Excellent. Excellent. All right, back to we're at the end of dot matrix. We're at the beginning of Postscript. Postscript was super slow, and as I recall, the licensing costs were fairly high, so machines were expensive, and people were saying this is not going to survive.
That's
but
right.
then what happened? It somehow survived.
First of all, you had the RIP. And the first company with a RIP was the Linotype, because the Linotype company had made a deal for the fonts.
And RIP means? Raster
Image Processor. So it would take your Postscript data, and then it would convert it into the dots where they were located. It created a raster file of a bitmap, if you will, at high res, and then allowed the laser to turn on or off to expose the photo material.
Okay, and that was a revolution, because all of a sudden you could, in any random place for, I don't know, there were like $10,000 or something for a image setter.
Actually $30,000.
$30,000. Okay, which is $10 million in today's money.
And the first one was on the Linocomp, the Linotron from Linotype, and then other companies made a deal on them as well. Again, they were limited in the number of fonts that they had, and they were very slow. In fact, when I did seminars, I would get a group of Postscript services, the people that output Postscript files. And my contest was who had the longest RIP time. And one guy, he said, I started it at 6 o'clock at night, and when I came in the next morning at 8, it was finishing.
And that's basically the time involved in getting the computer to figure out how to rasterize these fonts. You've sent it a data stream full of characters in Postscript, which is basically a programming language. And then it went through and rasterized those. But if things were complicated, or if it was a large job, it took a long time to go through that process.
It did. That was the biggest hangup. And so eventually other companies created Postscript clones that were faster. And so now we start to see the market expand, and more output devices now are adapted to handling Postscript files. Now, for a long time, the only fonts they had were the 13 and 35. I'll never forget, I was at a meeting, and Adobe was a speaker, and they gave me a copy of the first font they made beyond the original 13 and 35, and that was Garamond. And
wow.
they were thrilled that they had actually done a font.
I remember reading this book.
I was going to hold that up for you. Yes.
This was a fairly complicated. It explains how you use Postscript to make fonts, to make type.
Well, you remember the year before when Bill Gates and Warnock were on the panel, and Gates is explaining how he's going to introduce a new font format to compete with Postscript. And he says, we don't have a name for it. And I yelled out, why not call it off? And Warnock is sitting at the table with his back to Gates. So a year later is when they released that book, if you recall.
Ah, okay, right. He said we're going to open the font format. This is dated 1990, this book.
And that's a classic, by the way, because they only had a stack of them in the back of the room, and I grabbed one because they went so fast. A lot of people took multiples.
It was $17. It said $17 list price on the back here.
Oh, that may have been later on they did that, but it was a Seabold event, if you recall.
Yes, yes. I don't. I probably got this. I don't know. I probably stole it from you or somebody. All right. So Postscript is a big success, and then something else happens. PDF.
And that's one of the great stories of this industry. The way John Warnock used to manage was he would just wander around the company at different hours and just look.
He was an engineer. He was an engineer.
That's right. And he was always looking for ideas. And so he's wandering around the company, and they were trying to find a fix for, if you remember, they had encapsulated Postscript.
Yes, we still do. There's still EPS files floating around today. And
that was not a very efficient format at all. And you could not see the image when you positioned it. It had just a gray box. There were great limitations to EPS. And so he's wandering around the company, and he sees one engineer working on a method for taking the Postscript file, converting it to objects, and then storing the objects. And John says, that's interesting. So he gets more into it, and he writes a white paper on what they're calling Camelot. That was sort of the code for it at that time. And everyone said, oh, this is a great idea. And they then need a name for it. And they wanted to call it Carousel.
I remember that.
International rights. So it became, I'm having a mental block.
PDF.
No.
Oh, Acrobat. Acrobat, yes.
I'm sorry. See, some stuff is in there and some goes away. In any case, when it's first introduced, it's introduced as an ebook format, if you recall.
Yes, yes.
Remember the little black Apple laptops? They had a version of Jurassic Park as a PDF file. And if you clicked on the name of the dinosaur, it made the sound of the dinosaur. How they knew that, I have never figured out.
Right. Well, everybody knows what dinosaurs sound like.
So,
I mean,
again,
I've watched the Flintstones.
The PDF was essentially looked at as a ebook format. But then in '95, AGFA said, you know something? We could use this as a high resolution file to drive. We've got plate setters, we've got image setters, we even have digital printing machines. So they hired me and my students at RIT to write the first book about using PDF as an imaging file to transport files for reproduction. By the way, those 4 students have done extremely well in this industry because they wrote most of the book. And, and it got translated into 6 languages. And from there, that became the primary way we moved files from where the creator created it to where the output service outputted.
All right, let's fast forward now to the World Wide Web.
Yes.
All of a sudden we can look at things on our screens that have type on them. How did that type come to be? Where did Tim Berners-Lee get fonts from?
They were all bitmaps in most cases in those days, because you were very limited on what you had in terms of fonts. There were a few companies. In fact, one of the ways Monotype Imaging got into the business was creating fonts for websites, because you had no standard way. None of the standard typesetting companies sold fonts for websites. They only sold fonts for printing. So that was a limitation for a long time.
Well, and the other thing is that the fonts for a website, I mean, I'm not sure how it was in the beginning, but now the fonts for a website live on your computer, not, right? The browser renders them based on local data. And if you don't have that font, it gets downloaded one way or another.
Or gets subsetted.
Yeah.
But by the way, that was one of my arguments with Steve Jobs. I disagreed with his decision to use Courier as one of the first 13 fonts.
Yeah.
His argument was that people would do letters the way they always did them. I said, no, they're going to do them in Times Roman or Helvetica. So today, Courier is the font you don't want to see. It's the default font when something goes wrong.
But it's nice to have monospace fonts nonetheless. And Courier was the only one back then.
Why do you want a monospace font?
Because I want to simulate a punch card or something.
Oh, okay, all right. Well, that's the only reason. Historical reasons.
Well, no, programmers, you want to see things line up. Every indentation is very important in writing software.
By the way, in the legal world, they still use monospace fonts because they can calculate how many words things are very easily.
They can't calculate words by using Microsoft Word count?
character count.
Oh, okay. Okay. Well, anyway, here we are on the internet now, and there are billions of fonts. What did you say there were? 1 million fonts?
Okay, now let's be careful. I keep track of typefaces.
Okay, fonts versus typefaces. Let's talk about that too.
No, they're all the same. A font is a collection of glyphs, that is letters, numbers, whatever, in a particular typeface. At one time, it meant in a particular typeface in a particular size. So we use the word font and the first word typeface interchangeably, and that's perfectly okay at this stage of the game. So somewhere around January of 2022, we went over 1 million typefaces. Now, Times Roman is a typeface, Times Roman Italic is a typeface, etc.
Okay.
So over 1 million. How you can deal with that, I have no idea. And those typefaces were designed primarily for print, but in today's world, they can be used on the web as well.
But there are fonts specific to web. I mean, Microsoft and others spent a long time designing fonts that would look good on web browsers, right?
Yeah, Verdana is a good example, by the way.
Yeah.
They wanted a font that could be either print or web compatible. My feeling is, as time goes on, there'll be no difference.
Okay. I mean, well, until we get to holographic fonts, right? And then we're all wandering around with goggles, and that font technology will be something different.
I can just picture Helvetica in 3D. That would be something.
Yeah,
else.
imagine you could walk around the letter form. When you want to kern it, you push on it.
But that's the world we're in right now, because we read most of our newspapers online.
Sure.
And so designers of newspapers want different fonts the way they had them in print. And by the way, they want to be able to create one file that can be used for both print and for the web. They don't want to have to do 2 different ones.
Well, that's the holy grail, isn't it? And you want to have one file that prints, that displays on multiple devices with multiple resolutions and multiple aspect ratios and everything else. And it's quite an interesting problem. We're not going to talk about it in this show. We might get to that another time. But something that we're coming to the current generation, and I have 2 questions. One is, how can you go to freefonts.com or whatever and just get a font for free? Somebody worked to make that font. How are they getting revenue from when I grab a copy of XYZ Fraktur?
You're talking about Google Fonts, I think.
Well, there's lots of different sites that give away fonts, and some of them are stolen and some of them are actually legitimately free.
Again, we're using the word stolen in quotes at this stage.
Okay, sure.
So that's probably how they got them. And by the way, there are about 20 programs out there for making type.
Okay.
I just did an article listing them all. It's amazing how many there are. And at one time, there was only one from Peter Caro. And now there are a gazillion. So everybody can make their own fonts, literally. So these companies can easily take any kind of artwork and put it through a number of different utility programs. And on the other side, modify a few letters, and they've got a whole new font ready to go. And so there was no work in doing it. There's no designer that had to be paid for it. That's it. So why not give it away? And by giving it away, they're also probably on their website selling something in order to make money.
Right, well, they certainly have ad revenue and et cetera. Okay, so that's that question. The second question is, what's the future of type and typography? Are there things to be done?
Today, I got 2 email blasts. Every day I get 2, one from fonts.com, and I forget the other one. Between the 2, there was 60 different typefaces being announced. And that's only 2 websites that market type. That's 60. There are probably 4 or 5 others that are marketing type that I don't have. So every day there are probably 100 to 200 fonts that are being promoted. That's every day of the year. Do the calculation. And those are the fonts we know about, not the ones that people are doing for special purposes, for a special design project or whatever. If you do Netflix, you may be one of the few based on the latest news. If you notice, when you go down and look at all the movies they have, each one is like the little card that's in the front of the VHS cassette. And
that's another show we should do. Nobody remembers those.
Well, the interesting thing is every one of them has an image and some type. And I tried to figure out how many typefaces were repeated, and it was almost none. So of the hundreds and hundreds of movies and documentaries and TV shows that are on Netflix, they're using every typeface on earth from what I can see. And the same is true if you look at books and you have the covers of the book, they reproduce it for you. It's like all of them are different typefaces. So even though there are over 1 million typefaces, people are using them all.
And we want more. As a designer, I want a look that's new and fresh, and people won't say, that's Helvetica. I don't like that, even though they don't realize what Helvetica even is.
Or they take Helvetica and modify it.
Yeah.
Which they can do now. And so it's a brave new world on type. So there are going to be more and more type. It's not going to end. Now, someday someone's going to have to identify all these fonts. I have no idea how they're going to do that. Although there are some utility programs out there that help you. What the font is one of my favorites.
Yeah. Yeah. And they do that by matching against the database of existing, basically, coordinates for the different parts of the letters, right?
That is correct.
Yeah.
So again, we have a lot of fonts and we're going to have a lot more. There's no end to it. So if you're by the way, graphic designers, we graduate 4,000 graphic designers every year from baccalaureate programs in America. 40,000. 40,000.
Okay.
Where they find a job, I have no idea.
Well, because graphic design has become de-skilled, as many other things have, right? It used to be hard to be a video editor, and now there's TikTok and everything else where you just shoot and go. So if I'm sitting in my random office and I say, I can design this, I've got Microsoft Publisher or whatever, or even Microsoft Word. I don't need InDesign. I don't need Quark Express. I don't need any of those things. I just design it, and it's good enough. Remember there was a thing called Good Enough Color?
Well, it was, and Good Enough Type.
Yeah,
Remember
Good Enough Type.
When the laser writer first came out, it was considered to be 300 DPI was good enough.
Yeah, yeah.
And the world changed.
It did change.
I did Type World magazine, and when a 600 DPI 1117 laser printer came out, I stopped all typesetting. I went directly to the print. I did the whole page at one time with Quark Express out to a full page. The only thing I couldn't do were the pictures. And within a few years, I was able to do the pictures as well.
Right, right. Yeah. So I think we've been going for what? How long? Wow. An hour. So maybe this is a good time to wrap it up. Do you have anything that I haven't asked you about that you want to talk about?
No, just to mention that this is the 100th anniversary of the coining of the term graphic designer.
Really? And who coined that term?
William Addison Dwiggins, in 1922, wrote an article about the fact that there was a new skill set out there for people who designed things for reproduction, and he called them graphic designers.
Huh. Well, that and $1 still won't get me on the subway, but it's good to know.
Do they have subways in Seattle?
No. Well, there is a light rail.
Okay.
It doesn't go very many places. Do they have subways in Haverhill?
No, they don't.
Okay. So Frank Romano, thanks so much for being with us. You are an industry legend, someone who has so much knowledge at the tip of your fingers that it's incredible. And I hope you're passing it on to people.
It's scary. Actually, my latest book is the second edition of the history of photo typesetting. The one before that was the history of desktop publishing. And the one before that was the history of the Linotype company. The one that's at the printer right now is the history of the Ludlow typograph. So I'm trying to encapsulate the history of all these areas in books. And because the museum has phenomenal resources, they have unbelievable imagery of the machines, the promotional material of the time. And so the one I'm working on right now is the history of the typesetting service, because I have almost all the typeset specimen books that were out there.
Mm.
So it's an interesting challenge. So I'm trying to put it all into books.
Well, I think that's excellent. I've heard of books. I hope they'll be online at some point somehow.
They're PDF files on paper.
Huh. I'll have to see if I have the technology to read those. But anyway, Frank, thanks so much for being with us. And I hope you live another 100 years and do more stuff with this, because the history of how we communicate is intricate. Let's edit that out. The history of how we communicate is intertwined with type so much, you cannot separate it.
Absolutely. our technology changed because of typesetting. And as we got into digital type, then we realized that once it was digital, we could do color and graphics and all kinds of stuff. And that's the world we're in today. And thank God for the PDF file. And by the way, it wasn't apparent that the PDF file would win. Remember, there were competitors to PDF at the time.
Yes, we'll go through that in our desktop publishing segment. But for right now, for type, I think we're done, even though we could talk for another 5 hours. But Frank Romano, Professor, are you Professor Emeritus now of MIT?
Yeah. Professor Emeritus, that means unemployed academic.
Of the Rochester Institute of Technology. Thanks so much for being with us. And we'll see you again on another Creative Conversations.
Take care, Chuck.
Bye-bye.